Even those who sincerely, with all their heart, trust in their own goodness and reject Christ, they too will be judged by the word of Christ. In other words, sincerity will not be the standard of judgment. Though they were sincere in their beliefs that I'm a good person, God won't reject me. But how many sins does it take to separate us from God? One sin. This really gets back to Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2. Our sin, just one, our sin separates us from God. And there's only one, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23, there's only one way to have that barrier, that separation removed, and that's by the blood of Christ. Turning to Jesus, obeying His gospel. Right. Yeah. I don't remember exactly where that verse is found, but I think I know the verse you're thinking about. 2. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Believe. Yes. Yes. Another person who's jumping ahead in my notes. Usually it's Lewis. Usually it's Lewis. That's like I'm like the next paragraph, in my notes. He's quoting the verse already. So, yep, exactly. Yes, thank you for that. So remember, Jesus said that he who rejects me. So he's in the context of this is John 12:48. In the context of the verse, he's talking about those who reject him. He who rejects me and does not receive my words has that which judges him. The word that I've spoken will judge him in the last day. So, number one, we see there that the standard of judgment on the day of judgment for all men, even those who reject Jesus, will be the word of Christ. He who rejects me and does not receive my words is that which judges him. The word that I have spoken will judge him in the last day. But here's another point about that verse that you really don't want to miss, and that would be, if the word of Christ is the standard of judgment for all men on the day of judgment, then that means that all men are accountable to the word of Christ. You can't be judged by a standard you're not amenable or accountable to. So what goes along with that verse would be all men are amenable to Christ. When Christ reigns as king, which he reigns as king at this moment from heaven, God the Father, Jesus said, gave him all authority in heaven and on earth. And so Jesus, who reigns as king this very moment, has all authority in heaven and on earth. And so that ties in with John 12:48, because when all men will be judged by the word of Christ, it means that all men are accountable to the word of Christ. He reigns as king over all men. The point is, though, is very few submit to his authority. That's the point that we're making here. So, as we continue in Acts 23, we got about 5 more minutes. As we continue in Acts 23, after Paul stated that he had lived in all good conscience before God until this day, the high priest Ananias commanded Paul to be struck on the mouth. Paul said to the high priest, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. Those who stood by said to Paul, do you revile God's high priest? At which time, you remember having read that passage at the beginning of the class, when those stood by Paul said, do you revile God's high priest? That's when Paul said he didn't know that he was the high priest. And then he quoted Exodus 22, verse 28, which says, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So here lies a biblical principle that's Paul here stating it in the New Testament, quoting from Exodus, but a principle that we see in the New Testament as well. we are not to speak evil of those in authority. Rather, we are to pray for them, as the Apostle Paul wrote. The Apostle Paul himself wrote, if you go to 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 and 2, therefore I exhort first of all that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and all who are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't oppose the evil that comes forth from evil policies. I'm not saying that. But the principle is we don't speak evil of those in authority. We pray for them. We pray, like Paul said, for those in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. So in other words, we're to pray for all those in authority that the decisions that they make and the actions that they take may result in the free course of peace and godliness in the land. And by the way, this is the very reason why the congregation here at Summerdale had the prayer meeting that we had on a Sunday afternoon back in July earlier this year, shortly after the attempted assassination of President Trump. That's the very reason why we had that prayer meeting, is because we wanted to lift up to God all those in authority. As Paul says here, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and reverence. And so I'm going to go ahead and conclude the class at this point. So we'll pick it up next Sunday morning, because Billy said he'll be out of town next Sunday morning as well. So we'll pick it up next Sunday morning right around verse 11 of Acts 23. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.